Last week, the U.S. officially triggered the review of our North America Free Trade Agreement, USMCA. When it was originally agreed upon, Trump called it, quote, the fairest, most balanced, and beneficial trade agreement. But that was in his first term. Now he has taken a sledgehammer to the global trade order and is causing all kinds of uncertainty, especially for Canada. We don't know exactly what will happen next, or even if there will be a free trade deal at the end of it. Canada has had a free trade deal with the U.S. for decades now, and as our biggest trading partner, the stakes are high. Mark Rendell covers economic issues for The Globe. He's on the show to tell us what the U.S. wants and what Carney's goals are in this crucial trade negotiation. I'm Cheryl Sutherland, and this is The Decibel from The Globe and Mail. Hey, Mark, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So last week, kind of quietly, an important development happened in Canada-U.S. trade relations. And this is a review of USMCA that began. What does that mean exactly?
So you might remember NAFTA, which was the trade agreement we signed in the 1990s between Canada, the U.S. and Mexico. Back in the first Trump administration, there was a renegotiation of NAFTA, and it became, what we call USMCA, or, in Canada, we call it CUSMA. Down in Mexico, they call it TMEC. There's it's just raining acronyms. Point is, what emerged from that was a clause that said every 6 years you have to review the agreement. And that was new. That was something that was added to this North American Free Trade Pact. So for a long time, people thought this 6-year review was going to be pretty bureaucratic, pretty technocratic. Each side could air their complaints and deal with it in a sensible way. Then all of a sudden, the 6-year review lands in the middle of the second Trump term. So we are now trying to renegotiate this Continental Free Trade Pact at a moment where Donald Trump is essentially blowing up global trade. He's put tariffs on all of his trade partners. He has put significant tariffs on Canada and Mexico in direct contravention of this Continental Free Trade Agreement. And so we've spent months and months and months talking about trade negotiations, deals, all this kind of stuff between Canada and the U.S., which is essentially amounted to little more than, a couple officials texting back and forth. It's been very informal, essentially offers and counter offers on the back of napkins scribbled in crayon. That's got to nowhere. Those talks collapsed at the end of July. But what we are getting into now is a very formal process. So instead of informal texting, we're going to see armies of trade lawyers, armies of bureaucrats sitting down, trying to hash out, what does it actually mean to proceed with continental free trade in a new protectionist era?
What are the possible outcomes of this review? I understand there's like 3 possible things that could happen.
Yeah, there's essentially 3 things built into the review process. So the 3 countries can agree to renew the entire agreement for 16 years. They can also agree to go to an annual review process, which will kick off basically annual reviews for 10 years. Or, at any point in time, the 3 countries can actually, pick up sticks and walk away and agree to basically kill the agreement with 6 months notice. So we don't actually know exactly how this is going to play out. A lot of this is being driven by the United States. We're at the very early stages of this process now. So it's a consultation. They'll get into formal hearings in November. So Canada has also kicked off its own consultations. This is the second time it's done them. It did them last year, but obviously a lot has changed since then. We're not going to know until January whether the U.S. wants to seek a comprehensive renegotiation of the agreement or wants to make smaller tweaks around the edges. The deadline everybody's working towards isn't until next summer, so it's basically by July 1st of next year. The 3 countries need to come to some sort of agreement about what they're going to do, but they could very well come to some sort of, negotiated agreement before then.
Mm-hmm. So then what is at stake for Canada in this moment?
Yeah, so, just like NAFTA before it, USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it, underpins, hundreds of billions of dollars of Canadian exports to the United States. It is the bedrock for, our very integrated supply chains with the United States. It has also become a significant shield for Canada in the ongoing trade war with Trump.
Yeah, so
back in February, when Trump first started slapping massive tariffs on first Canada, Mexico, and China, and then everybody else, you may remember we were talking a lot about something called the fentanyl tariffs, which was initially like a 25% across the board tariff placed on Canadian goods. It's since risen to 35%. But the crucial thing is, Trump turned around and offered a massive carve out from those tariffs for goods that comply with the USMCA's rules of origin. Now, what that has essentially meant is the vast majority of Canadian exports are continuing to enter the United States tariff-free. So upwards of 85, 90% of products, even though, we get all these big headlines about these massive tariffs on Canada, the reality is because of the widespread compliance with the USMCA, most goods are still entering the U.S. tariff-free. So given the carve-out, the average effective tariff rate on Canadian goods entering the U.S. is only about 5.5%. That's the lowest of pretty much any country in the world. So that exemption is absolutely critical. While it is protecting Canadian trade, it's also raised the stakes of a successful renegotiation for USMCA because if the deal was to suddenly collapse, then, that 35% quote unquote fentanyl tariff would suddenly come into effect. And, we wouldn't be talking about 5.5% average effective tariff rate. We'd be talking about something closer to 35%, which, for Canada's very trade-oriented economy would be absolutely devastating.
Right. You mentioned that we don't know exactly how this would play out. We had these kind of like three scenarios. What's the impact of having so much uncertainty around how this process will go?
So since Trump started levying tariffs on everybody, that has had a direct impact on companies' ability to sell into the United States, but it's also had a impact on, business confidence, business willingness to invest, all of that. The uncertainty about what type of renegotiation of the USMCA we're going to get, whether it's going to remain in place, how it could possibly change across different sectors, that's putting a freeze on business investment in the country. So Canadians would obviously love to see a renewal in which you get another 16-year extension. If we get to a process of annual reviews, which is one of the possible outcomes, that's very bad.
That sounds very complicated.
It's very complicated. It's very bad. Again, we don't get that kind of certainty because the question about the future of the USMCA will continue to be at stake. And then obviously the worst possible outcome is they just, pick up and walk away. There's the possibility that they could try to seek, rather than a trilateral deal with the U.S. and Canada, the Trump administration may look to do bilateral deals with Canada and Mexico. So there's a range of possible outcomes.
Yeah. On the question of certainty, we've seen over the last 9 months that Donald Trump has little to no respect for rules-based trade. So why should we believe this review of USMCA will be any different?
Yeah, that's the trillion-dollar question. How much does Donald Trump actually care about the USMCA? He has contravened the letter and spirit of the USMCA in a number of ways in the last, 7-8 months. The tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, that is a direct breach or direct violation of a number of, side agreements we signed in 2018, 2019 to disallow, those Section 232 tariffs. There are also signs or signals that he does still care about the USMCA. I think the biggest and most important one is the fact that we did get that carve out for USMCA compliant goods. So there is also a lot of pressure from, U.S. companies who have supply chains in Canada and Mexico, who rely on Canadian and Mexican markets. There's a lot of pressure on the White House to keep USMCA, to keep some sort of free trade in place. But yeah, who knows? I mean, I think people would point very much to that exemption as a positive sign.
Okay. And just briefly, you mentioned Section 232 tariffs. That's steel, aluminum, and some other industry-specific tariffs that exist. And Section 232 is a reference to the legislation Trump is using to instate them.
Yeah, that's correct. So there is a number of other Section 232 investigations. So one of the complicating factors of the USMCA is we're going to see more tariffs before we see fewer because they've launched investigations into aerospace, into trucks, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. So, it's very probable that we're going to see tariffs on all of those industries in the coming months as we're trying to negotiate the USMCA. So that's very complicated.
A lot of things happening at once here.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dig into this. So what do we know about the issues that the U.S. will likely bring up in this review?
Yeah, so it's not a mystery. Donald Trump talks about it all the time. He doesn't like Canada's supply management system.
Of course, supply management, yes.
For dairy, for poultry. He has complained about restrictions on U.S. financial institutions operating in Canada. Autos are going to be a huge one. Back in 2018, during the first NAFTA negotiations, they pushed for 85% North American content in vehicles. In NAFTA, it was like 62%. Everybody settled on 75%. It's pretty clear they're going to push for a higher North American auto content as well. They may also press specifically for like a certain percentage of vehicles to be made of U.S. auto parts. So this is a long-standing issue for the United States. They want to see higher American content in North American-made vehicles to get that tariff-free trade across borders. The USTR also publishes a list, that's a U.S. trade representative, also publishes a list of grievances or gripes they have with other countries. It runs the gamut from a whole range of kind of agricultural issues down to things like they don't like our French language labeling, which gets, pretty dicey once you start talking about language laws in Canada, all the way down to the Online Streaming Act. There was a long-standing complaint about the digital services tax that was just introduced this year and then walked back. In many ways, I think Canada recognized that the digital services tax was going to become a major point of contention and preemptively backed off to keep the negotiations going. So you can also look at, what he has pushed for with other countries. That usually includes things like massive investment by those other countries into the U.S., big agreements to buy U.S. products, whether that's Boeing's or U.S. Energy or all that kind of stuff. So there is this real sense that in the new kind of Trump approach to trade, you got to buy your entrance. You got to pay the emperor to get entrance into the market. So I think that's probably all going to be part of the ask as well. And the final point I'll make is that Trump is using trade agreements as leverage to pursue a whole range of other political goals. So the big one is he's threatened NATO countries with tariffs unless they raise defense spending. You can expect to see that all to be part of this package as well.
I want to go back to supply management for a moment. The Canadian government passed legislation to try and protect it from trade negotiations last year. How will that affect how this issue is handled during the review?
Yeah, I'd say that's a juicy one. The Bloc Québécois pushed through a bill that was supported by all parties, which basically says thou shalt not offer up additional quota access to our supply managed industries in future trade negotiations. It's very clear that the U.S. does not like our supply management, and it's very clear that that's going to be a major ask for them. So, some trade experts think we're kind of backing ourselves into a corner that we're going to come to regret. There is a possibility that there's enough flexibility in the legislation to still allow Canadian trade negotiators to offer something. At the heart of the U.S. complaint about Canada isn't just the amount of quota they're allocated, but it's how that quota is allocated between different product categories, think like fluid milk, cheese, different areas within the dairy supply chain. So, there's nothing in the legislation that prevents us from saying, okay, we're going to change how we allocate those quotas. Canada goes hard for supply management. So, Godspeed, it's going to be a pretty contentious issue.
This won't be the last time we hear about supply management. That's for sure, right?
Certainly won't. Yeah. Keep your eyes on supply management, on autos, on a whole range of other things. Yeah.
We'll be back after this. Okay, let's talk about Canada. What do we know about what Canada wants to accomplish in this review?
Well, the biggest thing is they want the agreement to survive. NAFTA and then subsequently USMCA has provided the bedrock for a huge amount of Canadian trade and prosperity. It is also, in the current context, as we talked about before, protected a lot of Canadian trade from Trump's very aggressive tariffs. The big question is, what are they going to be willing to give up to preserve that agreement? The other thing Canada's going to want to try to get is some relief for these 232 sectoral tariffs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, what about these specific tariffs? Like we're talking about the aluminum, the steel, the auto, copper. Is there any hope that these will be lifted if Canada can successfully renew our trade agreement with the U.S.?
So they're trying to strike a deal right now. The big question in kind of trade policy circles in Canada is whether they're going to be able to, first of all, get agreements on these sectors at all. Secondly, whether they're going to be able to get them before the USMCA renewal really kind of kicks into high gear, or whether, discussions about steel, aluminum, autos will simply be rolled into the broader USMCA discussions. It seems to be that if we're going to come to some sort of agreement with the United States, it will probably be around things like quotas. So, the U.S. will accept a certain amount of Canadian aluminum, a certain number of Canadian cars into the United States at a lower tariff rate, probably not a zero tariff rate, but, down from 50 or 25% down to maybe low single digits or low double digits. It's kind of a best of a bad situation, potentially. Quotas can be very negative. They can limit how much you can grow. Carney has said he's working on a number of what he calls, quote unquote, small sectoral deals alongside the broader preparation for the USMCA renewal process. So whether these small sectoral agreements can kind of come to fruition in the next weeks or months, that still remains to be seen. And if not, all these issues are going to show up in the broader USMCA talks.
So we may have to accept some export quotas, but you also mentioned we're probably going to have to give some things up. So what are the most likely concessions Canada may have to make?
I mean, it's things we talked about before. It's around what the U.S. clearly wants. So it could be things like quota allocation for supply management. It could be things like higher U.S. auto content in North American automobiles. It could also be around stricter limits on how Canada and Mexico deal with China in particular. So in the USMCA compared to NAFTA, there was a clause that was entered in that basically said, thou shalt not negotiate with what they called a quote-unquote non-market economy, which is just a code word for China, without letting the other countries know. And the idea was it was meant to limit Canada and Mexico's ability to increase their trade links with China. Since then, Canada has largely aligned with the U.S. on things like Chinese EV tariffs on Chinese steel, that kind of stuff. Mexico's taken a slightly different approach, and there is considerably more Chinese investment into the Mexican auto industry and other Mexican industries, which has raised the hackles of trade professionals in the United States and politicians in the United States. That's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because limits on how Canada can deal with other countries is tough at a moment where we're trying to diversify trade.
Yeah, and on China as well. I mean, like the U.S. alignment has hurt Canada, right? Because China has retaliated with tariffs on our canola oil.
Yeah, I mean that was our own doing. You know, we chose to put 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and in return, we have seen significant tariffs on Canadian canola. Now, how much was that tariff because we wanted to keep out Chinese electric vehicles for the sake of protecting the Canadian market? And how much was it because the U.S. asked us to, and because within a integrated continental market, products that enter Canada enter the U.S.? I think probably the latter. I think as we're trying to move through this process of renewal, trying to figure out how much we are trying to diversify markets, find new trade partners, new economic opportunities, you got to balance that against the fact that the Americans are like, no, we do not want these guys playing in a North American backyard. And so that could be a deal breaker in the USMCA renewal talks. So that's a very delicate line Canada's going to have to walk.
So we haven't really talked about Mexico that much. Is there any common ground between Canada and Mexico that could help them work together in this review?
Absolutely. I mean, Mexico is the third partner in the agreement. It's a crucial part of, the continental supply chain across a whole range of industries. And it's a key ally for Canada in pushing back against the U.S. on a lot of its more aggressive or dare I say outrageous demands. So Mexico and Canada worked closely together in the 2018 NAFTA reviews. In fact, there was a period in which the Trump administration basically sidelined Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and essentially cut Canada out of the negotiation for a period of months and tried to deal bilaterally with the Mexicans. The Mexicans said, no, you have to bring Canada back to the table. So they were very important in keeping Canada in a renewed USMCA last time. They're going to be a key partner in it again this time. There are a number of areas they can work together if they can work together. And that's the kind of big question mark. So last year, just shortly after Trump got reelected and he started threatening everybody with tariffs, Canada kind of, or at least the Canadian political class, kind of abandoned Mexico. You saw a number of premiers, Doug Ford most prominently, Danielle Smith. It was kind of echoed by Chrystia Freeland as well. Basically said, well, let's cut out the Mexicans and just do a bilateral deal with the Americans. That pissed the Mexicans off to no end. They saw it as a giant betrayal, especially after all they'd done during the 2018 negotiations. And it really kind of soured the relationship. Mark Carney and his team have tried to repair that.
They were in Mexico last week.
They were in Mexico last week. That was to, announce a new strategic arrangement between the two countries, clearly designed to patch up a relationship that had become frayed, and probably to start strategizing about how they're going to, work together to push back against Trump. Because Canada and Mexico by themselves are minnows compared to the gigantic shark that is the very aggressive and angry Trump-led America. Working together, they have a lot more leverage. So, A successful renegotiation of the USMCA for both Canada or Mexico is going to require collaboration between the two countries.
And speaking of working together, I want to take a moment to talk about this idea of Fortress North America. Can you just take a moment to explain what that means?
Yeah, so that's a big pitch that some Canadian politicians have been making to the U.S. They're saying, in your grand geopolitical competition with China, you're going to need your buddy in your backyard. China has a lock on a number of aspects, like critical aspects of global manufacturing supply chains, all the way from ownership of mines to mineral refining to rare earths, battery manufacturing. There has been this real weaponization of global supply chains between both China and the U.S. The point being, one of the pitches from Canada is we can be your safe and secure supply of critical minerals. We can be your safe and secure supply of energy. So much of continental integration, the pitch that Canada has always made to the U.S. ever since, the Second World War and the integration of the two economies around a defense industry to fight the Second World War has been, we can do things together, which is not just economically beneficial to both countries, doesn't just supply opportunities for companies, but also will shore up security, all that kind of stuff. So that's the big Fortress North America pitch. The problem with it as well is that Canada is also trying to find new markets. It's trying to find new partners. We have realized that in a world with Donald Trump, where access to the U.S. market is no longer guaranteed, we need to be seeking out new export markets. We need to be seeking out new trading partners, all that kind of stuff. So a inward-looking Fortress North America approach may help you successfully get a renegotiation of the USMCA, but it will also be rowing against, or it could theoretically be rowing against, the goal of trying to diversify trade, trying to find new partners, all of that kind of stuff. So trying to secure the continental economy ultimately could come at the cost of trying to diversify at the same time. So you're walking a very narrow path.
Mm-hmm. So just lastly here, Mark, is there hope that there will be a deal without any tariffs?
Oh, there is no hope there will be a deal without tariffs. What I think Canada is hoping for is that at least for a large number of sectors covered by the USMCA that aren't being hit, and those strategic industries that aren't, the 232 tariffed industries, that we can still have some semblance of free trade for that, 85 to 95% of other products. That would be a win. Resecuring that would be a win. But it's going to probably entail giving up things in the process to secure that win.
Mm-hmm. Bit of a tricky road ahead.
Very tricky road ahead.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Mark Rendell, who covers economic issues for The Globe. That's it for today. I'm Cheryl Sutherland. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.